Welcome back to another episode of Stack Rex TV, Stack Rex Boxing, whatever you want to call it, right? When we talk boxing, but, we do talk cash from time to time. You know what I'm saying? The main purpose, the main prerogative, the primary purpose of this channel for y'all to get on here, sit back, relax, Mac Jack, Slack Jack, and Jack. Today I'm going to be talking about Raymond Muratalla and Andy Cruz and giving my prediction on that fight. Let's jump off. A lot of people coming into this fight, are giving the edge to Andy Cruz, based off what he's done in the amateur ranks. In the professional ranks, he only got 6 fights, right? We haven't seen much of him. The guy that he fought last, right, wasn't a great, guy to get him prepared for a guy like Muratalla. He was more of a punching bag, didn't have a lot of good defense, didn't have any footwork. Wasn't throwing any combinations, wasn't working behind the jab, and Andy Cruz went in there and made easy work of that guy, right? Like I said before, a lot of people are giving Andy Cruz the edge based off his amateur career, his amateur experience. Cubans, growing up in that Cuban system, fundamentals are number one. When you're working with Bozy, fundamentals are number one, defense is 1B. Right? I believe Andy Cruz coming into this fight, he going to be in tip-top shape, ready to go. The same Andy Cruz that we used to seeing, right? A guy that comes in the fight, work behind his jab, looking for shots. But, what I don't like about Andy Cruz, that sometimes, he tends to lean on, one shot at a time. I don't think that's going to work against a guy like Muratalla. Both of these guys are flat-footed, but Andy Cruz is one of those guys who is flat-footed, but, somehow he has good footwork, right? He could twist and turn a guy. He's 1 minute he in front of you, next minute he on the side of you, next minute he on the other side of you. He's one of those guys that could pretty much do it all. Muratalla, again, a flat-footed fighter, but, I love Muratalla's ability to throw combinations. I think that's going to work against a guy like Andy Cruz, especially, with the last guy that Andy Cruz fought, right? Again, a moving punching bag. You know what I'm saying? It wasn't much that I seen from Andy Cruz in that fight, only because, his opponent was very, lackluster of an opponent, right? Raymond Muratalla, he's been tested, back and forth. A lot of people are going back to that Tevin Farmer fight. He's fought a couple fights since then, and has improved, right? Again, working with Robert Garcia. Robert Garcia can draft and come up with a game plan, to beat anybody. We've seen it before. We've seen it with Valenzuela and Pitbull Cruz. And Valenzuela, like I said before, he wasn't known for being a boxer. But Robert Garcia drafted a strategy, drafted a plan, and he went in there and executed. I see no different in this fight. Right now to be Robert Garcia versus Bozy, as well as Andy Cruz and Muratalla, right? Bozy, one of those guys, he predominantly focused on defense, right? Muratalla's defense has gotten better from fight to fight, right? His head movement. When he's in the pocket, when he's throwing shots, he's getting out the way. He's moving his head, right? And everything that Muratalla throws is hard. Andy Cruz is one of those guys, he doesn't have a lot of pop. We seen it with the last guy he fought. He hit that guy flush and flush and flush and flush, and that guy wouldn't go down, right? You got a guy like Muratalla where everything he's throwing is hard, but he's not just looking for one singular shot. He know how to work upstairs, downstairs, and he got a beautiful uppercut, especially for the weight class. And he's a big guy for the weight class, right? Andy Cruz coming into this fight is not going to be able to just one shot. He's going to have to put the pressure on, right? He's going to have to throw combinations. He's going to have to step outside his usual box, and become a different fighter, to even put Muratalla in a position to be stopped, right? A lot of people on here saying Andy Cruz going to stop him. I can't see that, right? Obviously Muratalla, he got a lot of skill. Muratalla's game plan is to fight in the exchange, but we've already seen that Andy Cruz don't got that much pop. and he's not being built up as a guy with a lot of pop. He's being built up as a guy with a lot of skill, a lot of technique, right? In this fight, I got to lean with Muratalla. Right now, Andy Cruz, you got to give him, you got to take your hat off to Andy Cruz. Only 6 fights in, taking on a guy like Raymond Muratalla, who's already been in the professional ranks for a while now. Hasn't fought the guy, but has fought some guys. And I think that experience is going to play a factor in this fight. At worst, I can see this fight being a draw. But, I got to go with Muratalla because, not only just the power, not just the height, not just the reach, but, I've seen him get better since that Tevin Farmer fight. And I've seen him get more comfortable fighting his style since that fight, right? A lot of people want to lean to Andy Cruz having a lot of speed. Raymond Muratalla got speed too, right? Especially with those combinations, right? I see Raymond Muratalla winning a decision. Andy Cruz is one of those guys, like I said before, both of these guys got flaws. So you can say Raymond Muratalla sometimes doesn't step on the gas. You could also say the same thing about Andy Cruz, right? But like I said before, activity for me, if Raymond Muratalla comes into this fight more active, I believe he can get this W. You know what I'm saying? A lot of people are writing him off just because the experience that Andy Cruz has in the amateurs. But, if you look at both of these guys' last fight, if you look at both of these guys' last fight, Raymond Muratalla, went through some things, right? Andy Cruz didn't go through those things. And if it's anybody that has the high likelihood of hurting, dropping, or stopping their opponent, it has to go to Muratalla. Obviously he's the harder puncher, right? He's the guy looking, for the action. Andy Cruz, he's not a back foot fighter that like to twist and turn and, utilize a lot of the real estate in the ring. So I see this being a toe-to-toe battle, right? And I think that'll work against Andy Cruz because, not just because he's going into this fight as the shorter fighter or his arm reach is shorter, but, he tends to like to fight on the inside a lot. And I believe that Muratalla can catch him on the inside and, make this fight a different fight. Muratalla, again, like I said before, is getting better. And just when you look at these guys side by side training for this fight, unfortunately, it's not a lot of promotion for this fight. But just from what I've been able to see, I've seen a locked-in Muratalla, and I've seen Andy Cruz who just happy to be here. Obviously he gonna go in there and he gonna fight. But this isn't one of those fights, he gonna be in there showboating, and playing to the crowd. Muratalla got a lot of power, and he can catch Andy Cruz. So like I said before, my final prediction for this fight, I gotta go Muratalla decision. And this is gonna put this Andy Cruz and Keyshawn Davis fight, in jeopardy. Kind of like how Gervonta Davis be doing. He be waiting for other people to lose or whatever the case may be. But, even if Andy Cruz loses this fight, I would still like to see him and Keyshawn Davis.